Jonah, chapter 1, verse 17 through chapter 2, verse 10. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard me. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped about my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land.
I've been in Texas for 12 years now. Moved down here from Detroit. But 12 years ago, when we first moved down here, it was quite the culture shock, as you could probably imagine. From where I was to move down here was just different, right? There was big trucks with loud exhausts, and there was country music, and I had Kid Rock and Eminem and Stevie Wonder. And I don't know, you had country music, I don't know. And so it was just different, right? It was just a different thing. There was cowboy boots and things I just had never seen, like I saw them in the movies. And never really experienced before. And then everyone was so nice. Like, you guys are just so nice. And we come from a big Italian family. My mom's side of the family is all Italian. They're loud, and they're not nice. They're not nice. And y'all were so super nice. And what's interesting is I have a spiritual gift of sarcasm, and it doesn't exactly work very well down here. I'm really funny and witty up north, but below the Mason-Dixon line, it's just not as welcoming, apparently. And so these are all like things I had to learn really quickly. And one of the culture shocks that I experienced was even in the church. How church was, and kind of the church culture was just different. Church seemed to be something that you just did, right? It was a hobby. It was expected. And that's becoming less and less so as Fort Worth becomes more and more polarized, and it's not nearly as cool and popular to be a part of a church or to be a Christian, but it just seemed like something you did. Where I'm from, it's rare that people would go to church. If you go to church, it's because you're a Christian and you really love Jesus, because the other people around you, even people in your family, look at you pretty strange, right? They look at you weird. I've been told before at the dinner table, stop preaching to us, Jim. It's not as popular to go to church, at least where I was from. And so that was an interesting experience for me when we first moved down here. And then I learned very quickly that it was frowned upon to, maybe enjoy a nice glass of red wine or something. I was like, that's a bummer. Where are the Presbyterians? Where are the, this is different. And so that was a culture shock. And then one of the things that stood out to me the most was the blatant racism that I experienced as well. Not that I experienced, but that I saw against Hispanics, against African Americans, and it was under that kind of cover of Southern hospitality, but it was, maybe you had to be somebody looking from the outside in, but it was obvious, it was explicit, the racism that was down here as well. I remember discipling a guy a couple of years after we were down here, was discipling with a dude. We would go to CrossFit, and we'd go to my house for coffee, and we were studying books of the Bible together. And he literally said, without shame, without realizing how completely racist it was, he said, I'm not a racist, but, okay? Like, anytime you start a sentence with, I'm not a racist, but, the very next word is going to be racist, right? He said, I'm not a racist, but I would never let my daughter marry a black guy. That's just super racist, right? You know that, right? That's super racist. And so it was just experiencing things like that. It was a culture shock. It was different. And so when God called me down here to plant a church, it just didn't seem to make very much sense to me. An ex-jock athlete coming into Fort Worth to plant a church where it seems like there are churches everywhere, and it just didn't make much sense. Has God ever done that to you? He's called you to do something that didn't make sense. That's what it was for me, and that's what it was for Jonah as well. God's call on Jonah didn't make sense, and his call on Jonah was worse, was harder to swallow than moving from Detroit to Fort Worth, Texas. God's call to Jonah was to Nineveh. Right? Jonah was being called to Nineveh. That's present-day Iraq. Right? This is a call to Muslim extremists. This is a call to people that hate you. This is a call to people that have different political views than you, different religious views than you. They have different views on gender and sexuality than you. This is a call. Jonah's call was to his enemies. It was a call to love his enemies. Y'all weren't my enemy. You just were weird to me, and I was weird to you. Jonah is called to his enemies, and it didn't make sense at all to Jonah. And the themes in this story are they're relevant, they're helpful, they're even comforting to us as we look at this book. I mean, the book of Jonah reminds us that God rules the nations. In our age of political unsettledness and the election that's forthcoming and all of the maybe already angst that comes, the Bible reminds us, the book of Jonah reminds us of God's sovereignty and rule over all nations. It has themes of nationalism and racism and justice and mercy issues, and it reminds us that we too are to boldly proclaim the glory and grace of God, and even to a people who maybe laugh us off, and it reminds us that if we're to really love God, we're to love our neighbor, even our enemy. Right? It reminds us of all of those things, but first in chapter 2, coming off of Jonah's rebellion in chapter 1, he runs away from God. He says, no, I'm not going to go to my enemies. We get to chapter 2, and God comes after Jonah's heart. Before Jonah will go, God has to do work in Jonah's heart. And for many of us, before we go, God's going to have to do work in our hearts as well. Before we can change the world, we need to be changed. Jonah 1, in chapter 1, Jonah rebels against God. In chapter 2, God deals with his heart. And so in the same way, in Jonah chapter 2, God's going to come after your heart. But here's going to be your temptation. Your temptation, perhaps, is going to be to resist this, and your resistance might be by way of distraction. Some of you may look at this story, like many have looked at this story, and see the fish, right? There's a whale swallowing Jonah up, and easily laugh this off. Come on, Pastor, you want me to take this story seriously? You want God to come after my heart in a story about Jonah Airbnb-ing in the belly of a whale? Really? And we do that, right? We do that. When God comes after our heart, we start to argue theology. We start to, what about this over here, God? We start to push back on something, and we look at all of these kind of maybe surface level things that we're uncomfortable with or unsure about when we're trying to change the topic, and God's coming after our heart. Now, maybe you've got a problem with the fish, with the whale. Okay. Let's have first things first. Is there a resurrection? Right? Did Jesus rise from the dead? If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, we can go home. That's all that matters. If Jesus rose from the dead, can't God Airbnb Jonah in a whale? I mean, really? Is that hard for God? So let's not be distracted by those kinds of things. Let's not change the topic as God comes after our heart. The other thing you have to deal with if you're struggling with the reality of Jonah being swallowed by a whale is Jesus in the New Testament 3 times talking about it. And 3 times talking about it as a reality, not as a myth. And so if you don't believe Jonah in the whale, then you're going to have to deal with Jesus as well. What do you believe about Jesus now? Okay, so let's let the secondary things stay secondary. Let's let God deal with our hearts first, and then we can maybe go from there, okay? And so we're going to see 3 things in this prayer in chapter 2. First, we're going to see where Jonah is at. Where's his heart at? What's he thinking? What's he feeling? Where's he at? What place is he in? And then second, we're going to see what Jonah does as a response. What's his response? And then thirdly, we're going to see what God does. What God does, his salvation. Right? So Jonah's heart, Jonah's response, what God does, his salvation. So first thing, where Jonah is at, his heart. If you remember from the last couple of weeks, as Jake and Kanan did a great job leading us off in this book, God has called Jonah to Nineveh. He's basically told Jonah to go right, and Jonah went where? He went left. Right? He rebelled against God completely, ran as far away from God as he could. God brings about this great storm, and Jonah would basically rather die than obey God. Or he would rather die than even cry out to God for mercy. And so in verse 17, it says that the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And so that's where chapter 2 brings us. We see Jonah's prayer from the belly of the fish in chapter 2, and we see what he was feeling. We see where his heart was, where he's at, what he's thinking. We get insight into his heart. And so first we see in chapter 2, in verse 2, he says, I called out to the Lord out of my distress. This is fear. This is despair. This is depression. That's where Jonah is. And then in verse 4, I am driven away from your sight. He feels distant from God. Have you ever felt distant from God? Far from God. Jonah, he feels far from God. And then verse 7, he says, when my life was fainting away. I mean, that's the place that Jonah is in. In fact, Jonah has hit rock bottom. In fact, the imagery of Jonah so far in chapter 1 and chapter 2 has been continually having Jonah descending deeper and deeper and deeper until he hits rock bottom. Back in chapter 1, verse 3, it says that he goes down to Joppa. And then he goes down into the ship, it says. And then in verse 5 of chapter 1, he goes down into the depths of the ship. And now in chapter 2, he's going further down into the very depths of the ocean. Jonah has hit rock bottom. Everything has been stripped from him. All self-sufficiency, all self-righteousness. And until he hits rock bottom, salvation's not possible for him. Until he hits rock bottom, until all of that has been stripped away, salvation isn't possible for him. It's only until he completely fails that he can begin to see and change what's going on in his heart that God wants him to change. Now, we shouldn't wait till we hit rock bottom, but sometimes we do. Sometimes that's what it takes for us to hear God and see God and for everything else to be stripped away. In verse 2, when he says, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, this is the despair of sin. So you can get to this place, you can get to rock bottom because of the consequences of somebody else's sin. Right? Somebody hurts you, somebody betrayed you, you go into despair, you hit rock bottom, this is terrible. You can get to that place of distress and despair when something just in the way, like the world is broken and there's suffering. And we just get to this place of despair. But specifically, Jonah hits rock bottom because of the consequences of his sin. Sometimes it's just our sin, and we're just dealing with the results, the consequences of our own sin. And out of that, he is distressed. Out of that, he is in despair. And one reason why I know that this story is true and not a myth or a fable is because it deals with the real stuff of life. I mean, this is real feelings. This is real stuff. This is real despair. This is depression and distance. This is the consequences of sin, and it's painful. It's painful when we sin. And we have to face the consequences of that sin. And not even just that we got caught, but the way that we feel. Have you ever been in that place where you did something and you knew it was you? Like you did it. You were wrong. And now the weightiness of guilt is heavy on. There's a gravity of guilt on you. And there's a darkness of shame that's over you. It's a cloud over you, and you don't really know what to do. Have you ever been in that place? The consequences of sin, the distress of sin, that's where Jonah is. That's where he is. And here's what he does, though, okay? This is his response. In verse 2, again, he says, I called out to the Lord out of my distress. Right? This is a prayer. This is a cry for mercy. In the midst of his depression, he's calling out to God. And then the second part of verse 4, he says, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. In verse 7, he pretty much says the same thing. I'm looking, my prayer came to your holy temple. He's looking now to God in the midst of his distress. It reminds me of a famous quote from a Puritan pastor who says, in your sin, you take one look at your sin, but 10 looks at Jesus. That's what he's doing. That's what he's doing. And then he also says in verse 9, but I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed I will pay. He begins to commit himself to worshipful obedience. That's Jonah's response, to pray, to look to God, and commit himself to be obedient going forward. That's what Jonah is doing. And what his response basically is that in the midst of his despair, he's clinging to this gospel hope. In the midst of his despair, his response is full of gospel hope. And he hits rock bottom, but rock bottom doesn't save him. Crying out to God at rock bottom saves him. Prayer at rock bottom begins to change him. In verse 2, when he cries out to the Lord, I called out to the Lord out of my distress. Right? Out of the belly of Sheol I cried. When he does that, this is the most holy human thing that you can do. Holiness is you calling out to God in every situation, but especially in the midst of sin and distress. This is a gospel hope that Jonah is clinging to. Sometimes it feels like you can only get out those desperate shotgun prayers, Lord have mercy. That's what Jonah does. And he cries out to God. It reminds me of the parable that Jesus told of the sinner who stands far off from the temple, and he can't even look up to the heaven. He can't look up to God. He can't even look up to the temple. And he says, God, what? Be merciful to me. I am a sinner. And it's interesting because Jesus contrasts that guy, the sinner who's crying out in the midst of the consequences of their sin, in the midst of their despair to God, with the hyper-religious, super moral, really, really great Pharisee, who his prayer as he draws near to the temple and boldly looks up to the heavens says, I haven't done this, and God, I haven't done that, and I'm certainly not like this sinner over here. And Jesus shocks his hearers when he says it's the sinner that leaves justified, the sinner that leaves rescued and saved and accepted by God, not the hyper-religious, moral Pharisee. This was what Jonah is doing. He's crying out, beating his chest, looking to God in the midst of his despair. And he doesn't, in the midst of all of this, lean on his, what we've already seen, what we will see, is a blatant self-righteousness that he has. He doesn't lean on himself. He doesn't try hard. He doesn't swim harder. That's not Jonah's response in where he's at. He doesn't swim harder. Some of you are in place of despair because of the consequences of your sin, and you just try to do more. You don't cry out to God. You just try to do more. Or you have a theology of karma. You have a theology of works, and so you just swim harder when things are going bad for you, when there's despair, when you've sinned again. But that's not what he's doing. This is a gospel hope that Jonah clings to. He thinks that he, a sinner, could cry out to God, and God will hear him. That's his theology. And it's right. The good news of Christianity isn't that you should swim harder. The picture of Christianity isn't that you should be better or clean yourself up when you've messed up and then come to God. That's not the picture that the gospel paints. Right? Some of you have that picture. You feel like the gospel is painting the picture of you had to take a shower, put on your church clothes, and walk through those doors vowing to be better today. That's not the way that the gospel has painted. That's not what this is. The picture the gospel paints is that you come in these doors still smelling like last night's sin, still wearing the clothes from last night, coming in here crying out for mercy. And when you walk in, God says, welcome. 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 We didn't turn anybody away this morning. We didn't turn anybody away. You walk through those doors, literally or figuratively, in last night's clothes, smelling of last night's sin. We give you a front row seat to the grace of God. We didn't turn anybody away. Jonah cries out in despair because he believes, he knows that God will receive him. He knows that God will accept him. And the reason why he knows is what he's doing in verses 4 and 7 when he looks to the temple. Or when he looks to the temple, he's looking to where sin is atoned for. Or the temple for Jonah is where sacrifices for sin were made. Instead of us paying the penalty for our sin, something else died in our place. An animal was sacrificed in Jonah's place. And so he looks to the temple knowing that's where my sin was atoned for. That's where forgiveness is had. Like Jonah looking to the temple is like us looking to the cross. We can look to the cross and say, have mercy on me. We can walk through the doors, whatever we are, whatever we've done, because of the sacrifice of Jesus. We can look to the cross as Jonah looked to the temple in the midst of our death and despair too. There was a picture that maybe some of you all saw that went viral a couple of weeks ago, and it spoke to this. It spoke to the, let's show them that. It spoke to this idea, right, where religion is, I messed up, my dad is going to kill me. Some of you, that's your idea of God. That's your idea of God. You had to clean yourself up before you came here today because you wanted to present yourself in a different way. You were vowing to not mess up again, but the gospel says, I messed up. I need to call my dad. That's where Jonah is at. He calls out to God in the midst of his despair, in the midst of his sin, and he's clinging to this gospel hope. And what Jonah is doing is what I want you to learn to do. He's preaching the gospel to himself. I want us to learn how to do that. I want us to grow in that, where you preach the gospel to yourself in the midst of sin and despair. For Jonah, he's not going to be obedient to the Lord. He's not going to go to this hard call to love his enemies until the gospel has taken root in his heart more and has uprooted all the other stuff that's keeping him from, that's making him rebel, right? That's leading to his rebellion against God. Right? We have to preach the gospel to ourselves before we're going to be able to preach it to others, before we will preach it to others. Okay? That's Jonah's response. What does God do? What does God do? There's three things, actually, that we see God do. One of the first questions you want to ask when you're reading the Bible is, what does this text tell me about God? What is God doing here? Okay? And what you'll see is three things that God does in this text. And the first one's going to be hard for us. Okay? In verse 3, Jonah says, for you, God, for you, cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Jonah is saying that literally and figuratively, these waves of suffering, these waves that have swallowed him up, are God's waves. For you, cast me into the deep. God created the waves. He spoke the waves into existence. Jesus spoke to the waves. He calmed the wind and the waves. They obey his command. These are God's waves. God has done this. In the book of Job, when Job is in the midst of his suffering and he's questioning God, one of God's responses to Job was to talk about the waves. Right? He says in Job 38, verse 11, Job, was it you who said to the waves, thus far shall you come and no farther? And here shall your proud waves be stayed? Did you tell the ocean to stop? No, I actually thought about this verse a couple weeks ago. We were on spring break. We were at the beach, and the wind was blowing, and they had the red flag out, right, which means you can't swim. And I was thinking, like, how can they tell me not to swim? It's an ocean. They don't own the ocean. Right? They don't own the ocean. I should be able to swim in the ocean whenever I want to swim in the ocean. In fact, the year before, it was the same place, but a friend was with me, and the red flag was up, and we were just like, we're going to swim. Right? So we just went in, right? I'm an Enneagram 8. We don't like to be controlled. Don't give me, right? Don't Well, I'm not the rule follower in the family. My wife is. And so we went into the ocean, we swam, and then we got in trouble. And so you like the swim of shame back to the beach, and we get publicly, rebuked by the lifeguards there. And I tried to Jesus juke him. I said, man, who was it you? Was it you who said to the waves? It didn't work. Jonah recognizes that in God's sovereignty, ultimately this was God's doing. For you cast me into the deep. And in chapter 1, verse 17, just the verse above here in chapter 2, it says, and the Lord appointed a great fish. Right? That's sovereign rule. So God appoints a great fish. God was sovereign over the storm, and he's also now in control over the waves. For you cast me into the deep. It's interesting, like Jonah was suicidal, right? The sailors picked Jonah up and physically threw him into the water, but Jonah rightly recognizes that God is in control. For you cast me into the deep. God decreed it. Here's the thing, and this is where it can get kind of weighty. This is where maybe the gravity of the reality of God can press on our hearts in such a way that just can make us uncomfortable. And it's because we like to whittle God down into kind of a nice little cute God fairy. But what Jonah is saying, and what is true for you as well, is that nothing that has happened in this story has happened apart from God's will. Nothing. The scriptures are very clear that God is over everything, in control of everything. I'll give you a couple of examples. God is in control over the heart of the most powerful person in the land. Proverbs 21:1, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wills. God is in control over life and death. Right? Deuteronomy 32, see now that I, even I, am he, and there is no God beside me. I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal, and there is none that can deliver out of my hand. God is in control over evil things. Isaiah 45, I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord who does all things. God is in absolute control. And so Jonah says, for you cast me into the deep. And I know some of you, like there's already a resistance that comes up in your heart. This is another way in which we want to be distracted when God comes after our heart. And we resist that and we say, no, that's not how God is. God isn't like that. God wouldn't allow bad things to happen. How could God be good and he permits cancer? How could God be good and he allow infertility? There's no way that that's how God is. And yet I would ask, if God wasn't in control of all of that, would he be God? Who are you going to pray to? Why pray at all? If God is in control of those things, what kind of God are you left with? Does it comfort you to believe in a God who has no control over suffering and evil? Does that comfort you at all to know that God is subject to the whims and desires, selfish desires of people just like you are? He could be betrayed and do nothing about it just like you. He's a victim too. Does that bring you comfort to worship a God like that? Why pray? Why cry out to God? Why worship a God who is powerless to the evil in the world, powerless to bad things happening? An impotent, powerless God who is unable to be in control of those things isn't a God worth worshiping. But God, a God who is over all those things, who purposes all those things, who makes all things beautiful, that's a God that we can sing to. What are we doing singing if we don't believe that God can do anything? And here's the thing, and this may be the most important thing that you hear today. If God never cast you into the deep, like if he wasn't over all of that, and if he never cast you into the deep, you would never know how deep his love was for you, ever. Because you wouldn't realize, you wouldn't have seen, you wouldn't have experienced the depths that he would go to for you. You wouldn't know that. Sometimes we have to hit rock bottom. Sometimes everything has to be shattered for us to find Jesus down there. And to know that he still loves us. We can cry out to him and he'll say, yeah, welcome, son. Welcome back. Come here. Daughter, come here. I receive you in my grace and in my mercy and in my love. His mercy is deep. His love is deep. His grace is deep. Sometimes you need to be cast into the deep to experience it. So God is over suffering. He casts him into the deep. The second thing we see God do is in verse 2. Jonah says, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. God answers him. The second part of verse 2, out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. God hears Jonah. God listens to Jonah. God hears Jonah's prayer. God isn't just sovereign and big and glorious and over the wind and the waves. He also is near and will hear you when you cry. There's something called the transcendence and immanence of God, where God is transcendent, right? He's huge, he's big, he's sovereign over all things. He's over the waves, he's over the suffering, but he's also immanent, he's near. Right? He's close to us, he's near to us, he hears our prayers, he cares about our grief. It's the transcendence and immanence of God. Some of you overemphasize the transcendence of God to the minimization of the immanence of God. And so your God is just kind of out there. He's distant. He's not all that involved in your life. He's the man upstairs, right? The man upstairs, and you don't really pray to him because he doesn't really care so much about the inner workings of your life. Your life isn't centered around that God. He's just there, and you kind of give lip service to God in his existence. There is a God. He's out there. He's big. He doesn't care too much about me. But then some of you kind of emphasize the immanence of God to the expense of the transcendence of God, right? Where everything is like God's my buddy. And he just really loves me, and he wants to help me, but he's never big. Right? He's never big. He always wants the best for you and you know what that means, right? Because like buddies, you guys are all in agreement all the time, and he's always going to do what you think he should do, and always going to say what you think he should say, and you have to feel near to him and close to him. He's never big to you. But what? He's both. God is transcendent and immanent. He's huge. And he's near. He's over the waves, and he will hear you cry out when you are swallowed up by the waves. God is both. He's transcendent and he's immanent. And the book of Jonah shows us a huge God, but a God who will also draw near. Here's the thing. You need the bigness and the nearness of God in the midst of your sin. Jonah needed a huge God and a God who would love him and hear him and be near to him as well. You do too. If you're addicted to pornography, you need a huge God who can deliver you from that, who can get you out of that. Man, that is something that you need, a powerful God. But you also need a near God, a close God, a God who will love you and be near to you and grieve with you every time you fall. You have an eating disorder, you need a huge God, a God who will deliver you, a God of power, and a God who is near. In the midst of our sin, we need both. We need the God that is huge and the God that is near. Jonah, that's what he sees. Jonah, that's what he experiences. The big God who can deliver him, a big God who can appoint a great fish to save him, but also a God who will listen when he cries. And then lastly, we see that God saves. In verse 6, Jonah says, I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. He feels trapped. He's in prison. He's going to die. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. And then the second part of verse 9, he says, salvation belongs to the Lord. And then in verse 10, and the Lord spoke to the fish. It's kind of funny. And it vomited Jonah upon the dry land. I'm sure that was pleasant. But God saves Jonah. Right? You brought up my life from the pit. Just like Jesus rose from the dead, we get to rise from the depths, saved and delivered from our sin. And yet there's indication, even in this text, that Jonah, the gospel hasn't fully taken root yet. There's indication even in his prayer, and we of course know from later in the story, and we'll get to it, that the gospel of grace hasn't fully done its work in Jonah yet. In verse 8, Jonah says something that's true, but he doesn't seem to realize that it's also true for him. He says in verse 8, those who pay regard to vain idols, right, those who would trust in false gods and trust in anything that's not God, they forsake their hope of steadfast love. And he's right. He's right. Like God's steadfast love, in the Hebrew, it's his hesed love. This is God's grace. This is God's love that is never ending, never giving up, comes after your heart. It's the love that's coming after your heart right now. And what he's saying is that those that would put their trust in something that isn't God, idols, false gods, they're forsaking that love. That love, they're not going to experience that love. Right? If your heart is still resistant, if you're still trying to distract from God coming after you right now, if you're still trusting and holding on to something else, you may not experience the grace and love of God in this moment right now. And he's right. He's right. But what he doesn't realize is that he has idols still. It's going to be really clear later that his idols of nationalism and racism and self-righteousness are still rooted in his heart, and the gospel is yet to uproot them fully. So the gospel still hasn't fully done its work. And we'll get to it in a few weeks, but for now we can just rejoice at the work that God is doing in Jonah in the same way that we can rejoice in the work that God is doing in us. But this is why what the non-believer needs and what the believer needs is the same thing. What your non-Christian friends need is the same thing that you need, the gospel. The gospel to continue to do its work in your heart, to root itself in your heart. What your friends need is what you need. And until we realize that, we probably aren't going to go to them with the humility and desperate need that we should, because we realize that they need the same grace that we do. There is absolutely a point in your personal history, if you're a Christian, where God saved you. Right, where the grace and glory of God collided with your heart and you were saved. That is true, but God's not done with you yet. And the point isn't to just work harder. The Christian life isn't to just try harder. You need the gospel to take a deeper root in your heart and to uproot everything else. We don't just swim faster. We turn to God again and again and again and again, and we cry out, oh, I messed up. I better call my dad. So Christian, you need more of Jesus. You need the gospel to take deeper root in your heart. And non-Christian, salvation belongs to the Lord. You need Jesus too. You need Jesus to save you too. But for all of us, the more that the love of God towards us is experienced, especially in the midst of our sin, the more that we will begin to love others, especially in the midst of theirs. Loving God, loving people, inextricably linked. And the more that you experience his love, the more that you're going to love others. And of course, we need a God who is transcendent and immanent, one who is big and near. Even as we, like partners of this church, especially as we're working on this evangelism stuff, Jesus puts forward in Matthew 28 the Great Commission. And in doing so, he gives two reasons for why we can, okay? And it's his transcendence and his immanence. He says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. That's the transcendent Jesus over all things. And so what does he tell us to do? Go, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We're going to do that in 6 weeks. Teaching them to observe all that I've commanded to you. And then here's the immanent Jesus. And behold, I am with you always. You can boldly proclaim the gospel because Jesus is transcendent and immanent. He's huge and he's near. Right? All that God is calling us to, we need to experience all of God. All of God. That does its work in us, that we can go out and do what God has called us to do. There's a gal in our church who She sent in a cool story last week as she was talking about she's committed to sharing the gospel with one friend or family member that's not a Christian this year, like the rest of the members of this church. And she had a gal that she's been supposed to be praying about. There's a friend of hers that has a really dark history, just a lot of pain, a lot of darkness, a lot of abuse, just does not have a good view of God or Christianity at all. And she confessed to her city group that she was just struggling with praying for her because in her mind, quote, there is no way I or God could ever change her mind. But then God gave her this great opportunity to encourage this gal with gospel truths. It was really beautiful, and it was just powerful experience. And afterwards, she felt like God told her as she was praying, she felt like God told her this: I want this girl. I love her. She is my daughter. Will you let me teach you to be my hands and feet to her? And then he said to her, who are you to think that you can pick and choose who gets to hear the gospel and experience who I am? God is coming after her heart, doing work in her heart as she goes to proclaim the good news of Jesus to the hearts of others. That's what God is doing to Jonah. That's what God is doing in you. The gospel taking deeper root in our hearts so that we can go and we can take the gospel to the hearts of those that he has sent us to. And we can rebel like Jonah, or in the midst of our own sin and despair, we can cry out and see God change us and see God love us and uproot all of our fear and sin and idols and self-righteousness, that we might be bold people in the city of Fort Worth. Let the gospel do that work in you now, and trust that he'll do work through you as we leave this place. Let's pray. Father God, thank you for this truth, the gospel truth, that when we are in despair, you will hear us. Thank you that we can mess up and call our dad. God, some of us didn't have that kind of dad, and so that's just hard for us to understand. Our sinful dad shaped our theology, and so we struggle with that. Would you just speak truth into some of our hearts that are struggling and wrestling with that right now? God, some of us are swimming faster and we're exhausted. We're exhausted. We've hit rock bottom. Would you deliver us? God, as you come after our hearts right now, personally, intimately, specifically, even speaking to our heart, what you're uprooting, maybe idols we're holding on to, trusting. Would we experience in the depths at rock bottom your deep, deep love? Jesus, in the same way that Jonah was in the belly of a fish for 3 days, you went to the depths for us and were 3 days in a grave. Would we find you down there? Near, gracious, merciful. Would that change us? Would the Paradox Church people be a humble, bold people. Humbled by our own sin, humbled by a God who is so near and good to us, but bold because our God is big. Spirit, would you do this work in our hearts right now? In Jesus' name, amen.